World War I began when a Serbian nationalist assassinated the Austrian-Hungarian Crown Prince in Sarajevo, setting off a chain reaction that would bring most of the world's largest countries and economic powers into war with each other. On this slide, I've included a little bit of information about the countries who in 1914 had entered the war on the two sides. So on the Allies, the Russian Empire, France, UK, Finland, French colonies, British colonies, and the other countries that are listed there. The Central Powers, Austria-Hungary, Germany, and German colonies. And I've also listed on the slide the total population of the two sets of countries. So you can see the Allies had a population of almost 800 million. The Austria-Hungarian, German, Central Powers had a population of about 150 million. You can see the territorial difference, 67 million square kilometres versus 4.1 million square kilometres, and also the GDP at the time being about 3 times greater for the Allies than the Central Powers. And so that's a point I'll come back to when we talk about some of the issues to do with the war. This is a snapshot at 1914. Obviously this changed during the war as other countries were drawn into the war as well, most notably of course the United States on the Allied side later on in the war. When we think about economics and war, I think there's 3 main ways in which we can think of economics having something to say about war. First of all, economics may be able to throw some light on the question of why a war like World War I happens. Secondly, it may be able to tell us something about the outcome of the war and who wins the war. And finally, it can tell us, well, finally, we can use economics to understand about the consequences of war for economic activity, both during and after the war. Now, of course, there's a variety of other disciplines which are going to have useful knowledge to contribute about the nature of war and the consequences of war. So economics is just one discipline area that has something to say about wartime activity. What I'm going to do in the rest of this section of the lecture is say something about each of these 3 questions, spending most time on the issue of the consequences of the war for economic activity. So first of all, while there were obviously a variety of other factors that contributed to the beginning of World War I, it's generally considered that economic factors played some role. So first of all, to some degree, World War I, for example, the dimension between Germany and France was between contesting possession of what was seen of economically valuable areas of land in Europe. And as well, there was conflict between countries that were members of the Allies and the Central Powers over their colonial possessions and the economic benefits that those colonial possessions were believed to bring to the countries having those possessions. Battles over economic resources are generally considered to be sort of one contributing factor to the beginnings of World War I. If we think about the second issue of the determinants of victory, so in the end, if we think about the outcome of war as a result of the amount of resources and the efficiency with which those resources can be applied, then it's possible to sort of think about the determinants of victory as breaking up into a series of sort of factors. First of all, the outcome of war is going to be determined by the size of the economy. So other things equal, a larger size of economy, the more GDP, the more economic output that's being produced, the more a country is able to use those resources in fighting against other countries. Secondly, there's the share of resources committed to war. So countries could have different sizes of their economies, different amounts of output, but to the extent that they commit different proportions of those resources to wartime activity, that's likely to affect the outcome from the war. Thirdly, there's the efficiency of the uses of resources in war. So it's not just about the amount of, for example, military hardware that a nation or a group of nations can put into a war. It's about sort of the effectiveness of those resources. So if you're building sort of some military item like missiles or tanks, it's about whether they're actually successful in achieving military objectives. And obviously there's also issues of strategy in terms of deploying the resources. So there's a human element in terms of how the military forces, the human population, and also the military hardware is deployed in fighting the war. So the size of the economy, the share of resources committed, the efficiency of the use of resources, those three things together determine the amount of resources that effectively a country puts into war against other countries. The other important factor in fighting a war is, of course, it's important during the war to be able to sustain the population, both the population who are fighting the war, but also the population in the country who is involved in the war. And so countries' ability to, for example, feed their populations, so their agricultural capacity, especially during war when international trade tends to break down a lot, became increasingly important for countries to be able to feed their populations, both the population at home and the population fighting soldiers, other military forces fighting a war. And countries that were better able to sustain, feed their populations, likely to be more successful in wartime activity. Timing matters as well. So of course it's not the case that countries have exactly the same share of resources committed to war throughout the whole war, or it's not exactly the case that they use those resources with the same efficiency throughout the war. So for example, if we think about World War I, you might remember from the first slide that there was a large disparity in the amount of resources, population, land size, GDP that the Allies had compared to the Central Powers. So, for example, if they were both committing the same share of resources to the war and both doing it with the same efficiency, we would think that the Allies would be in a strong position to win the war because they just had more resources. And in World War I, the Germans realised that and hence attempted to sort of win the war quickly. So attempted to gain an advantage in the war by deploying a large share of their economic resources at a relatively early stage against the Allied powers. So when we think about these factors, size of economy, share of resources, efficiency of use, we shouldn't think of those as sort of applying uniformly throughout the war. In fact, the extent to which they apply varies across the war, and that becomes a matter of strategy as countries attempt to win the war against each other. For example, the Germans sort of, by committing a relatively large share of resources at an early stage of World War I, sought to overcome the disadvantage that they had against the Allies, who had much larger total amount of resources available. This graph gives you sort of a perspective on this idea that the share of resources committed to war would vary during the war, and also you can see the point, Germany, which is sort of the greeny bluey line, you can see the point that apart from France, that Germany was ahead of the other Allied nations in the amount of resources that it was deploying for wartime activity. You also see the massive scale on which resources get diverted to wartime activity. A country's resources get diverted to wartime activity during a war. So at the peak in 1917, 60% of the output of Germany was being directed towards producing goods for wartime activity. Similar in France, and in Britain sort of 40% as well. So in countries that had a large involvement, in this case World War I, but in wars generally, there can be a very large amount of economic activity during the war directed towards wartime activity. The third topic on the nexus between economics and war is understanding the effects of war. And I want to start out just by sort of talking about the ways in which we might think of war affecting economic activity. Firstly, via an effect on GDP. So one way that wartime activity affects GDP is that it affects the productive capacity. So war involves people who otherwise would have been able to be in the workforce, being killed, being injured, reducing their productive capacity. If the theatre of war is in a particular country, it involves destruction of physical capital, buildings, roads. It can often involve as well sort of severe degradation to agricultural land. So war is likely to, both during and after the war, reduce the productive capacities of countries that have been involved in the war. Of course, as I just mentioned as well, another effect is that when wartime activity is on, that involves diverting resources that otherwise would have been used to produce, for example, consumer goods to wartime activity. And so the effect of that is that it may mean that a country is obviously, if it means winning the war, better off diverting the resources to wartime activity than not fighting the war, but nevertheless is still sort of worse than if the war hadn't happened and the country had been able to produce consumer goods as it would otherwise have done. The diversion of resources to wartime activity, that's an effect that, of course, is concentrated sort of during the war and the immediate aftermath until the economy goes back to sort of a state of not having to produce for being involved in a war. A third way war can affect GDP is that it can disrupt trade flows. So obviously countries that are at war with each other stop trading with each other, but also because of the diversion of, for example, shipping resources to be used in the war, because of the danger of dangers for commercial shipping during World War, you tend to get a major disruption to trade flows. So trades into the goods and services flows, migration and capital mobility all get disrupted during war. As well, war is a time when there's significant political uncertainty and instability, and that's likely to affect the incentives to, for example, undertake investment in a variety of negative ways. So generally we'd think of the effects of war on GDP being towards reducing GDP because it reduces productive resources, it disrupts trade flows and it creates uncertainty. And as well, in terms of what people would like to be consuming, it diverts what is being produced from consumer goods to goods that are being produced for the war. The other major economic consequence of war is its effect on macroeconomic stability. And here again, there's several effects. One effect is that during war, as I've mentioned, you have the diversion of the nation's productive resources from consumer goods towards producing military output. What that means is you have the same amount of spending power in the country because people are still being paid for the production activities they're doing, but you've reduced the amount of consumption goods which are available for them to buy with the income that they have. And so a common problem during war is that there's a shortage relative to the amount of spending power available of consumption goods, which generates inflation. And so often countries have tried to deal with that, for example, through rationing and through price controls, because there's this fundamental issue of the same amount of spending power chasing after a more limited amount of consumption goods having the potential to cause major problems with inflation. Second macroeconomic stability issue is to do with paying for the war. So countries that are very much involved in the war and wanting to win the war, obviously want to spend as much as they can on financing military personnel, financing, buying military hardware. And they can pay for that, for example, by taxing or borrowing from the local population, or they can pay for it by borrowing from international lenders. And in World War I in particular, a lot of European countries ended up significantly paying for the war. They were spending more than the income they had at the time, and so they ended up paying for the war through international borrowing. And so the need to, after the war, repay that borrowing caused problems in the extent to which the economy could be rebuilt rapidly. Also often sort of a source of inflationary problems as countries used means of increasing money supply as a way of trying to pay for the war. The third issue is adjustment process. So, a war, is a significant process of adjustment for an economy. In the first instance, you have a whole lot of resources that are diverted from producing consumer-type goods to the war, so you need to sort of fill the gap that the diversion of, for example, workers to wartime activity has left in being able to produce in the home country. And then, of course, when the war's over, you have the issue of accommodating all the military forces back into the economy. And so many countries, especially in World War I, found this a difficult adjustment process. And for example, often there was very high unemployment in the aftermath of World War I. On the one hand, countries were had these large debts that they'd accumulated that they needed to pay off, which imposed restraints on the extent to which sort of governments could seek to stimulate economic activity. But on the other hand, there was this huge group in the population needing to be accommodated back into the economy. And so that was often a difficult sort of process for countries to manage. As I said at the start of talking about the effects of the war, the important sort of in thinking about these factors to think about sort of short run versus long run effects. So some of these factors I've described sort of apply both during the war and after the war. Some of them sort of apply more after the war, such as paying for the war. Some of them apply more specifically to the period of war, such as the diversion of resources to wartime activity. So if you were trying to sort of bring all these factors together to apply to think about the effects of a particular war, you'd want to think about sort of the timing with which each of these factors applied. So if we think about sort of applying this framework to try and value the GDP costs of war, we can first of all think about sort of, well, what ways would we do that? Well, there's two ways you can think of, which are called direct and indirect. The direct is where you really nominate specific sources of costs and you try to value those costs. So we'll see an example of that in a minute, but that would be, for example, saying, look, one of the costs of war is that a whole lot of military forces are killed, and those people would otherwise have been available to produce goods and services after the war in an economy. So we're going to try and work out the loss of productive potential from these deaths that have occurred during the war. The other approach is what's called indirect. That's where you compare what actually happened to GDP during and after the war, and you compare that with some counterfactual, an assumed path for what would have happened to GDP if the war hadn't occurred. And both those approaches have been applied in different sort of contexts in valuing wars that have occurred. A couple of sort of general points about trying to think about or value the economic costs of a war. As this quote from John Morris Clark says, a study of war costs is either a relatively simple matter of tabulation and fiscal allocation, or else is an economic problem in soluble difficulty. And this is a nice quote because it makes the point that, well, look, there are relatively straightforward ways of trying to measure the cost of war. For example, as I just mentioned, you calculate the number of deaths and you try to value sort of those deaths in some way. But there are always big assumptions that you're making when you do that. And for example, how do you value a life lost? There are always aspects of the cost of war that it's difficult to sort of value. So on the one hand, we have some sort of straightforward approaches that we can apply to value the cost of war. On the other hand, it has to be accepted that it's an extremely difficult task to do and think that you're doing it in a way that accurately and comprehensively values the cost of war. On that point about valuing the cost of war comprehensively, of course as well, when we do think about economic costs of war, of which I'm going to give a couple of measures in the next couple of slides, we've got to remember that we're doing economics sort of, and that there are other perspectives on these issues of valuing the cost of war. So there's a quote from Michael Edelstein, which I like, which says, "It's absurd to think that the methods and perspectives of economic history can come anywhere near to comprehending the meaning of human losses from war. We're far better served by the speeches of Lincoln or the poetry of Sassoon, Brooke, Owen, Graves or Seeger." And so, just making the point that as in many aspects of understanding human society, economics has something valuable to contribute, but it's only part of the story. So a major recent study of the GDP costs of World War I that's been done by Reuben Glick and Alan Taylor has come up with the following findings. They focus on the costs to GDP from the losses of population, death and injury, and the trade cost, the cost of reduced trade during the war. And so they estimate that across all the countries in their sample, which includes belligerents, countries that were involved in the war, and neutrals, countries which weren't involved in the war, that there was a GDP cost from the population loss and injury of about 2.5% of GDP. And there were real GDP costs from the reduction in international trade that occurred during this period of about 4.5%. So this is a sizable sort of effect of the war on GDP. Basically, these days this would be about sort of 3 years of growth in GDP that's being lost because of World War I. And about a third of that is the population loss, and about 2/3 of that is the trade loss. And not surprisingly, those losses are concentrated amongst the countries that were actually involved in the war, although there's also a small loss from the reduction in trade imposed on countries which were neutral. This gives you a perspective on sort of what actually happened to GDP and a little bit of an idea of who were the countries who sort of lost out during the war. For some of the main countries involved, you can see that countries on which the war had a major adverse effect are, not surprisingly, the countries that are sort of directly involved in the theatre of war. So that's France, Germany and Austria. Russia as well, increasingly as the war goes on, and then whereas other countries sort of begin to recover after the war, Russia of course experiences the revolution in 1917, which means that its GDP remains at below half the level it was before the war for a long time sort of after World War I. There are also countries which are relatively less affected. For example, British GDP is actually sort of somewhat higher during the period of World War I, and the US isn't, in terms of its overall GDP, substantially affected. So there's a diversity of experience, and it kind of plays out in the way that you would expect, in that countries that were more directly involved in the theatre of war experience sort of larger adverse effects on their GDP. A country which undergoes further disruption after the war does even worse sort of than other countries which after the war finishes can begin to recover back towards their pre-war GDP levels. Although notice that with Germany and Austria, for example, even 4 or 5 years after the war is finished, they still haven't got back to the level of GDP per capita before the war. This graph gives a perspective on the human capital cost of World War I. So the blue line is what's called the dead equivalent as a proportion of population. This is a measure that counts anyone who is injured as half of a person who died and aggregates those two together to work out sort of a human loss measure from the war. And you can see that, again, for the countries that were sort of involved directly, most notably France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, significant human cost of the war. So adding together the dead and injured, it's up around sort of 6 to 7% of the population. The red line shows the cost expressed in terms of GDP of that population loss, and so you can see that's a similar magnitude, 7 or 8% of GDP reduction because of the loss in productive resources due to the war. And also obviously large losses on other countries. So Britain sort of 3%, Australia and New Zealand losing equivalent of 3% of population as well through death and injury. Romania and Serbia, similar amounts. Of course, there are other countries which have smaller percentage amounts, but where the absolute amount of human loss is larger or similar to some of these other countries, for example, the USA and Russia. Here's an example of the macroeconomic consequences of World War that I talked about. So here are some numbers of a price index in 1919 where the index was 100 in 1914. So basically you can think of the number in this column as telling you about the sort of the amount by which prices had increased in the period since 1914. So for example in Germany it means the prices had increased by a multiple of 4 in the 5 years since 1914. Now these days we'd think that a lot of countries aim to have inflation rates of sort of 2 to 3% per year. So over a 5-year period, that would be about 15% increase. Here we've got sort of a 4 times increase in Germany since 1914. And you see that there are no countries which are really sort of exempt from the inflationary effects of World War I. I mean, in Austria, the effect is huge, sort of 2,500 times, the index is 2,500 compared to 100, so 25-time increase. And so this is because of the sorts of issues I mentioned to do with shortage of consumption goods causing price inflation, countries inflating to try and repay debts after the war. Final thing to mention is the aftermath. So a lot of countries have ongoing macroeconomic problems. For example, the problems of inflation that were caused during the war, the problems of getting military personnel back to work. As I mentioned, high unemployment in a lot of countries after World War I. And then there was the issue as well of needing to repay debts that had been accumulated during the war and the effect that that had on the economy. For example, this quote from Liaquat Ahamed, the problem of German reparations was to haunt the financial landscape of Europe for the next 20 years. So the issue of Germany being forced to make repayments to the Allied countries for the cost of World War I was a factor that had huge effects on the German economy, but also big spillover effects on other economies in Europe during the 1920s. The other thing that emerges sort of in financial terms from sort of World War I, so I mentioned that one of the big issues in ongoing macroeconomic problems was the need to repay debts that had accumulated during the war, and the big country that countries in Europe owed money to was basically America. So as Frieden says, from 1914 to 1919, America changed from being the world's biggest debtor to its world's biggest lender. And so basically the baton of international economic leadership is passed during World War I. America, as we've talked about in the last lecture, has become the world's biggest economy, and World War I cements that in a way by making it the country that other countries now borrow from when they're in financial straits. Other consequences of the war, so it's the beginnings of the onset of authoritarianism, so the Russian Revolution, which creates the Bolshevik government, 1917, the Italian move to fascism in 1922, and of course then sort of a whole lot of other countries during the Great Depression. But the World War I created political instability, out of which there's a change in the nature of government in some countries, which was to continue on for later years. Another big point from World War I that cast a long shadow was the Paris Peace Treaty and the division of territories. So President Wilson, who was very influential at the Paris Peace Treaty, wanted the principles of self-determination and having a League of Nations to resolve, negotiate disputes, wanted those to be critical determinants of the way that national boundaries were redrawn. But in the process, it ends up that 60 million of Europe's population end up in new countries from before the war, and 25 million are ethnic groups who are in countries in which they're a minority. And Richard Holbrooke, in the foreword to Margaret Macmillan's fantastic book Paris 1919, which is all about the Paris Peace Conference and its consequences, says that some of the world's most intractable problems have roots in decisions made right after the end of the Great War. The four Balkans wars in the 1990s, the crisis over Iraq, the continuing quest of the Kurds for self-determination, disputes between Greece and Turkey, and endless struggle between Arabs and Jews, all in a way have their origins in the way the world map was redrawn in the Paris Peace Conference. In the next section of this lecture, I'll go on to talk about the beginnings and the underpinnings of the Great Depression.